The Galactic Empire was possibly the most authoritarian regime the galaxy had ever seen. We on this channel have covered many of their cruel laws and activities numerous times. We know that the Empire was particularly cruel to insurgents and rebels. However, how did the Empire deal with crime and justice on a bigger scale? And what exactly did the Imperial justice system look like? Now, before we really do get into it, I do quickly want to put a little disclaimer in that this is actually a pretty undeveloped section of Star Wars lore. Needless to say, the stories normally focus on the wars side of the franchise, with insurgents fighting against the tyrannical regime. And for this reason, it's pretty easy to forget about the trillions of everyday citizens living under the Imperial's boot. For this reason, we're going to be taking a pretty educated guess at what exactly the Imperial justice system did look like. Now, I don't want to spend too long talking about people who the Empire saw as actual threats. You know, rebels, Mandalorians, crime lords, etc. But we are just going to cover them really quickly. Now, generally speaking, rebels are not important to the Empire. If a leader of a rebel cell is arrested, then they're normally going to be put before a kangaroo court and made an example of in front of the galaxy's citizens. Likely either being imprisoned at an Imperial black site or just executed. Everyday combatants, however, generally speaking, will be arrested, interrogated / tortured, and probably killed. No courts or really anything. We also have things like violent and dangerous offenders, and this includes things like assassins, bounty hunters, or Mandalorians. And these guys generally will have a very similar life to rebels, unless the Empire sees them as potentially useful. If so, they may just be able to earn themselves a pardon for taking on suicidal missions on the Empire's behalf. And then let's quickly cover crime lords whilst we're here as well, or far more influential criminals. Generally, this differs from individual to individual. However, we do know that the Empire is pretty corrupt, and they have a very flexible ethics system. And for this reason, powerful crime lords, in some cases, were given a pass, if you will, such as Jabba the Hutt and many others. Simply put, they served a purpose for the Empire. They kept some semblance of law in areas that the Empire couldn't really be bothered to maintain themselves. And they offered valuable services, such as slaves and spice. As well as this, they're very likely to kick back a bit of their profits to the Imperials for looking the other way, and this is something that the Imperials generally can look pretty fine upon. Now, generally speaking, these crime lords are not going to do anything that's going to actually hurt the Empire or damage the Empire's reputation. And generally speaking, crime lords were not interested in rebel cells because they brought down Imperial might. So for this reason, you could basically count on crime lords such as Jabba or the Pikes to basically keep any sort of rebel activities or insurgencies at bay for you, meaning that the Empire can free up resources to use elsewhere. Now, for the main focus of this video, I want to be focusing on everyday criminals or suspected criminals. Petty thieves, pirates, gang members, or just people who refuse to pay their taxes to the Empire. Now again, this is very, very hazy in detail as there's not a lot of sources to go off. However, it's my belief that the Imperial justice system will have had a pretty strong look on crime and punishment. We know that the Imperial High Courts were generally managed, ran, and staffed by the Imperial elites, and therefore we have to imagine that efficacy wasn't necessarily their strong suit. It's very unlikely that the Empire had the same objectives of many modern justice systems, which is to reform the perpetrators, turning them into valued members of their society. The Empire's plan will far more likely have been to squeeze every single little bit of value out of a criminal, and then basically scare them enough to never commit a crime again. The Empire is not going to put criminals in a private cell like what the Republic did. No, it's far more likely that they will find themselves being shipped off to one of the many prison colonies, such as the one that Jin was sent to at the beginning of Rogue One. Here, criminals would be given a set amount of time to serve out their sentence, and they would face back-breaking labour and unsafe conditions, as well as cruel treatment from guards and wardens. It's very likely that many would perish, and anyone who did emerge from these places would likely be a shadow of their former selves once they returned. Not exactly a loyal Imperial, but either too scared to ever stand against them again, or possibly even more radicalized against them than before. Now we have the very big elephant in the room here, which is of course slavery, which is legal under the Empire in many cases. The Empire had a pretty clear view on slavery, and that is if it benefited them, then they were happy to go along with it. And although the Empire had few massive slave complexes of their own, they had their criminal friends for this. The pikes on Kessel, for example. You can imagine in a lot of cases, when someone was sentenced to hard time on many Outer Rim worlds, this didn't mean that they were just going to be sent off to an Imperial penitentiary. Especially if there wasn't one in a nearby system, or if there just wasn't enough space. And considering the poverty that's surrounding the galaxy and just the amount of people who live in it, it's very unlikely that there was always enough space in Imperial-ran complexes. It's very likely that these people were simply sold as slaves. On worlds like Kessel, for example, the lifespan of workers was not high at all, and after a couple of years, it was very likely that you would die there. Now, how exactly the Empire gets away with this is difficult to say. On worlds with massive populations, too big to keep track of, or Dust Ball worlds in the Outer Rim, where governors act more like dictators, the Empire can likely just make people disappear. No real need for paperwork. At the end of the day, no one cared about pickpockets or pirates, for example. And the Empire could get a bit of money to help fund their regime, so they'd be pretty happy to sell off their own citizens. We need to remember, at the end of the day, the Empire was a terror state. For this reason, if a family member or a friend simply vanished and the Imperials said that they were arrested and sent to a prison colony, which could be anywhere and they could have just been sold off into slavery, if you start making a noise and you start saying, well, I want to know where they are, what have you done with them, then I can see it being very, very possible the Empire would just arrest you on trumped-up charges, and you would also be sent to serve hard time. Ultimately, I think that the Imperial justice system will have undoubtedly been pretty messed up. It was ruled by self-serving bureaucrats, who will have had quotas to meet, and probably profited a lot from the amount of prisoners who they were able to sell and gain resources from. They likely had very little regard for the lives of the people, especially people who they likely saw as being undesirable drains on their resources. Now, as I do say, this is more of a guess than established law. However, I think this all makes a lot of sense, and it fits very well into what we do know about the Empire. At the end of the day, the Empire views its citizens as a resource, not as individuals, not as people. And the efficacy of how criminals are treated and how it reforms them and what happens in a larger scale is just not going to interest them. But what do you guys think? What did the Empire do with everyday criminals? And how did the Empire manage to get away with it? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share, and sub, as it is really appreciated and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at TheLawGuy and tick the bell to get regular updates whenever I upload. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching this video today. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you're all having a great day, hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you next time.